Hi, everyone. Welcome to Being Heard, how to use your voice so people listen. I'm going to give you a moment to gather. I'm Julie Moose. I'm Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Thank you all for making time to be here. And thank you especially to our guests in alphabetical order: Sewell Chan, editorial page editor of the LA Times; Nikole Hannah-Jones, who is Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter; Jake Silverstein, who is editor-in-chief of New York Times Magazine; and Erika Smith, who is a columnist for the LA Times. So we are looking forward to a great conversation among our guests for the first part of the program, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So please feel free to share your questions anytime in the Q&A queue. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. So we're going to start with a little bit of a recap of some of the things that have been happening in the world of opinion recently. And then I'm going to ask you guys to share your thoughts and talk a little bit about the purpose of opinion. So we've seen change at the New York Times following the Tom Cotton op-ed. We've seen USA Today say the op-ed by Peter Navarro fell short of their standards after they published it. At the Wall Street Journal, the opinion department responded to a letter from more than 300 journalists there who were concerned about accuracy. Feel free to comment on what's been happening if you'd like, or on things I may have missed. Excuse me, but my question is, what is the purpose right now of opinion pieces in news publications, and how is it changing? So why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, first of all, to the Press Club for hosting this. As a former DC correspondent, I know how important this organization is to supporting the journalism community and our highest values, so I appreciate being here. You know, I have a privileged vantage point from having worked on the opinion pages of two of the nation's great news organizations, the New York Times and the LA Times. And, you know, my answer is that it's actually, I see this moment as a particularly challenged time for the traditional divisions between news and opinion. Now, in saying that, I recognize I might horrify some people, so let me lay out a few things. I certainly think we know where the bright red lines are. A political column should not get into specifically endorsing a candidate or a public policy, or go so far as to, you know, urge direct political action. But I think it goes on the other side too. An opinion column, the fact that it's called opinion doesn't mean that it's free of facts. One thing I tried to emphasize as an op-ed editor at the New York Times a decade ago, which I think is still very much followed, is that, you know, great opinions are grounded on a solid bedrock of facts. In fact, the most powerful arguments, and I'm thinking about those advanced, for example, by Nikole at the New York Times Magazine, regardless of what we label them, the most powerful arguments are built on a strong bedrock of reporting, evidence, and research. Now, it is true with opinion that, you know, sometimes there are accusations of cherry picking or misinterpretation of data, and those are very, very important. But a great opinion editor tries to always ask, especially in my world, the op-ed world, what are the strongest possible objections to this argument? What are your fiercest critics likely to say? And how can you preempt or anticipate or address those questions? Now, why I think the news and opinion divide is getting harder is that news is moving in a more interpretive and analytical direction. What we label news, we've all heard this. It can't just be about, you know, chronicling the voices in power, quoting the police spokesman, et cetera, et cetera. It has to get at some underlying deeper truths, which include social context, historical context, the structural context. Those are things that traditionally have been practiced more on the opinion side. My solution certainly isn't to jettison the labels, but it's to recognize that the labels are becoming a little rusty and that we may need to start thinking a little bit more deeply about the definitions. What I'm more confident about is that the practices on both sides have to be grounded in reporting and fact.
Yeah, I agree with that. So it's interesting to hear your explanation of that. So I was on the editorial board of the Sacramento Bee. Now I'm a columnist at the LA Times. And, you know, I'm a relatively new columnist here at the Times, but I'm trying to do a lot more reporting columns and do a lot of interpretive and analytical pieces, and to do it from the state, you know, perspective of California. But I think it's kind of interesting that we as an industry are shifting back toward this more of reported type of column, type of opinion piece, which I can't help but see a reaction to the fact of the uprising of social media, which gave everybody an opinion. And so you have, on the one hand, this huge number of writers who just write and shoot their mouth off. And it became everybody has an opinion. But I think as an industry, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We have to not only report our pieces, and as you said, opinion cannot be free of fact, but also we have to kind of move the story forward, which I think is really the real goal and the real use of opinion, is to basically move the story forward, offer some, interpretation, offer some to peel back more layers. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, for us at the New York Times Magazine, we're in a slightly different zone, right? Because we're not an opinion page, so we don't publish straight up opinion columns with the kind of regularity that an opinion page would. And we sort of find ourselves in between the newsroom proper at the New York Times and the opinion page of the New York Times, which is to say, like, a lot of the stuff that we publish is just straight kind of narrative reporting. But then we also publish stuff that has a really strong point of view, and we publish some stuff that I think would fall into the straight up category of kind of opinion writing as well. So it's kind of a range, and often I think of it in terms of point of view and like how strong a point of view is in a story, and how, I mean, my strong feeling is that even in stories that claim to be straightforward reporting, point of view is obviously such an important determinant of what the story is that's being told. But you can kind of turn that up and down. You can modulate how much of an effect it has on the story and how it comes across. And sometimes, turning it up and really kind of trying to dramatize the point of view of a particular writer or a particular vantage is something that makes a piece stronger and makes it in some cases more truthful as well. So I often think about it in that terms, in that frame, in terms of point of view.
I don't have a lot to add to what's already been said, but it is an interesting position for me as a writer. I gave a talk to the Education Writers Association the other day, and I was asked, like, are you still one of us? Because, of course, I started as a straight news beat reporter. I spent most of my career as a beat reporter, and now I don't think I write opinion writing, but I think of my writing as making an argument, and making an argument from a clearly stated point of view. But nothing that I write is just simply what I think about something. It is using a lot of research, reporting, data to make an argument, but it certainly is not reporting with no point of view. And that's what I am allowed to do with the magazine, because the magazine, you do have voice, and it does sit in this in-between space. But when I think about opinion writing, the only opinion writing that I enjoy or spend a lot of time reading is that which is deeply reported. Brent Staples, when he writes a piece of opinion, you can see the amount of research that has gone into that. It's not simply what does he think about something, but he too is using historical facts and a lot of research to make an argument, and that is what we need. We have to be able to discern. I agree totally with Erika that you have to be able to discern the type of internet writing that is just people saying what they think, and opinion writing that is actually reported and based in fact.
So given that distinction, we'll start, Erika and Nikole, with you guys, how do you identify what you want to pitch, and how do you pitch those topics that you feel like accomplish that purpose? And then Jake and Sewell, afterwards, if you can talk a little bit about kind of what your tactics are for catching pitches and for working with writers who have a strong, grounded in facts perspective.
Well, I mean, for me, I have no interest in just preaching to the converted, so to speak. I always try to look for opinion pieces or stories or that kind of go against the grain in some way. One of the columns I recently wrote looked at the face mask debate that's going on everywhere. But there was a protest outside of the California Capitol in Sacramento, and I went out and talked to a number of people there just to kind of get their sense of not only about the face mask debate, but also this broader issue of that's going on in Portland with federal agents, abducting people, basically, and how that these folks outside the Capitol who are standing on the ground of government overreach and Gavin Newsom is taking my rights, how they feel about, the same thing happening in Portland to an extent, another version of government overreach, and just really just trying to suss out what logic or lack thereof was behind their argument about not caring. And so, I mean, it's a story that you could report in many different ways, but I think there's some value in talking to the other side, even in this broader sense of the debate, even if it's only to show how they get to this conclusion, because what also happens is that you have, right-wing media that kind of just takes this narrative and just like spits it out there, and then there's no context. And so I think for me as a California columnist and understanding how diverse this state is politically, that there is some importance there. But I guess as far as deducing pitches, I just look for something that allows me to tell a new nuance of a story and to get at a bigger truth. And not to say that every single piece, unlike the New York Magazine, I'm writing more off the news more quickly, but getting at it in piece by piece by piece and talking and getting at what I think is the core of California, what I think is the core of the truth here, and kind of peeling away. That's kind of how I like deduce and sort through pitches.
I don't really know how to answer that, because I don't ever feel like I really just pitch. I just feel like I have a conversation about something that I'm interested in doing, and I'm blessed enough to work with people who respect my instincts enough that typically, I don't think I've ever pitched anything at the magazine that I've been told I couldn't do it. And usually it sometimes it's just me having a conversation and then being told I have to write what I just had a conversation about. But to me, so it's interesting, Erika, when you say you don't want to preach to the choir, because I think the hallmark of my work is showing the choir that they're not actually in my choir. It is writing pieces to people who think that they are on the side of the issues that I write about, and that I seek to expose to them that they actually are not. And I've said this all the time. I never think of my work being towards like the Trump supporter. My work is towards the Hillary Clinton supporter, who actually is not nearly as progressive on issues of race and inequality as he or she would like to think. And because of that, this is really where all of the historical scaffolding in my work comes from, is I want to really surprise people who think they know the story, who think they're the good people, who think they're on the right side of this, and expose the ways that they're not. And so almost everything that I'm pitching is in that vein of how do you hold up a mirror, which sounds like a cliche, but that's literally what I'm trying to do, is like, how do you make people who would normally skip over an article like this because they think they already know it all, how do you show them that actually you don't, and let me turn that lens for you a little bit and show you something different.
One of the interesting, most recent examples of that, I think, that comes to mind, Nikole, is your cover story that's right behind me right there on reparations, and the case for reparations, which, that most of that piece is an incredibly powerful, the word you just used was historical scaffolding, to make people understand this kind of economic inequality that has existed for, decades, centuries in this country. And it's straight up history writing. It's straight up a presentation of, Sewell, you were talking about kind of grounding everything in facts. And that's what so much of Nikole's work does. And part of what I think about is that often when we're talking about, some of the stuff that Nikole writes about racial inequality in history, is that writing about a particular episode of history from a point of view that has not been the prevailing point of view from which that history has been told to date is a different experience for many, many readers. And sometimes they label it opinion because it's a different experience, right? Because they're being told a history that they, understood one way in a different way. And that therefore their kind of recourse is to consider that opinion. But of course it's not. It's about considering which point of views have been the story that you're reading have been told from historically, and how a new point of view that tells that story differently complicates that view.
If I could just add to that, clearly the difference with my work is I don't pretend that I'm coming from an objective point of view, which so much writing that is clearly not objective pretends that it comes from an objective point of view. And I'm stating explicitly, this is what I'm going to try to do. And that way you can determine, did I do that? Do you buy my argument or not? But I think so much of what we see is people pretending, or, you know, it is our journalistic standard to not have a point of view, or to write in a way that acts as if we don't have a point of view when in fact we do. And so, for instance, with a piece like What is Owed, I hear and read people who are opposed to reparations. I know all their arguments. I know all the reasons that they say they're opposed to it. And then as I'm writing, I'm answering every one of their objections. And that is very intentional. So you do have to, you know, anyone who's good at this always knows the perspective and viewpoints and rationales and ways of thinking of the other side. And you were writing in a way to address that and hope to convince people, or at least expose the weakness in the other person's argument, which is strategic.
Can I ask you a question, Nikole? I don't think I've ever asked you this before, but those arguments that you are talking about anticipating when you're writing, obviously they are constantly evolving, right? Like the argument sort of against, you know, broadly speaking, racial justice and other forms of equality that you write about is constantly evolving and, you know, taking new approaches and angles. I wonder if you feel like your activity on social media kind of like clues you into what that argument is and how it's evolving and how to anticipate it?
Well, yes, that's why I tell you that I have to be as active on there as I need to. It's part of my job and research. But truly it is, yes, because I see the commentary all the time. I see what arguments people are making, what stories people share over and over again to rebut certain things. And it gives me really a clear view of then what I need to address. And one thing I hear all the time is like, people are like, why are you talking, you know, engaging with this person with 100 followers? I literally don't care how many followers you have. To me, like what is amazing about social media is it is democratizing in that way. And there was a time where I had 300 followers. Did that mean that I had nothing to offer intellectually, that I should have been just dismissed? So I learned a lot. You know, sometimes I probably don't have to try to smack down the person with 300 followers as much as I do, but I feel like they deserve it. But it is very instructive, and in a way where the things that I'm naturally inclined to read, it's never going to be the Federalist, right? It's never going to be like, that's not the thing where I wake up in the morning and, you know, we have our 5 newspapers and we have our 5 sites that we check all the time. But I get to see all of those arguments that are being made across media like the Daily Wire, right? I see it because it comes into my timeline.
I'd like to make just one point about the objectivity kind of versus moral clarity debate as it's emerged. It's obviously a gigantic topic that we could devote hours to. But, you know, one person I have found helpful in the debate is Tom Rosenstiel at the American Press Institute, who talks about objectivity. He says that objectivity is often misunderstood, and that in its modern form, it's like The View from Nowhere, which Jay Rosen and others have consistently criticized, which I hope that all of us can kind of agree it's probably something that needs to be dead and buried. I mean, in the sense that we all come from somewhere, no matter what we're doing, whether we're covering crime for the Associated Press or history for the New York Times, we all are human beings with powerful, you know, shaped by powerful social and other forces. Tom is saying that objectivity is best understood as objectivity of method, and a much more narrow thing about testing of hypothesis against evidence, more like the scientific method. And I actually think when you see it that way, that is not at all an activity or practice that is in conflict with journalism that seeks ultimate moral clarity and in so doing affirms democracy. The big shift that I would say has occurred in my orientation toward both news and opinion journalism over the last 4 years has been, I've moved in a more communitarian direction, and that I think journalism ultimately needs to affirm some vision of community. Now, that could be dangerous. In the past, that community as we envisioned it was often white, male, elite, business owners, blah, blah, blah. And it now needs to be much more, I think, the community of voters, the community of people that are going to decide this country's future at a moment of peril. You know, so, we have slightly different vantage points because I'm still dealing with a lot of people who are in a very, very conservative Trumpian world, and they want to be represented somehow, whether in our letters to the editors or with more columnists. And I'm still trying to weigh that. But for me, instead of pretending that I can be objective among all these choices, I'm trying to take a more community-oriented approach.
So what does that mean in terms of like how you try to do what you just finished saying is a challenge for you to do in terms of representing voices, from across the political spectrum?
I think the LA Times has had a more unsettled identity in some ways than the New York Times in terms of whom it serves. New York Times started in the 90s, of course, reaching a much more national audience, but that national audience tended to be people who are liberal and well-educated. The Los Angeles Times generally has a liberal leaning audience, but there are streaks of kind of conservatism and libertarianism that, as Erika has written very aptly, kind of in a way match our kind of Western identity. And you, Jake, are a Californian, so you probably understand that even better than I do. But I would say the main thing the main thing I would say I'm thinking about, though, is that, for much of its history, and we're planning to examine this, the LA Times very much was part of building Los Angeles as a place. And so the owners here, this is obviously a century ago, different set of owners, but they were literally involved in the creation of Dodger Stadium and where to locate the harbor and the port and how to move the water from the Owens Valley into the San Fernando Valley, like what you see in Chinatown. They helped build and craft this city. And that project was very much tied up with a certain kind of boosterism, a certain, patronizing attitude toward the communities that have always been here, namely Indigenous and Latin American, and then starting in the 20th century, African American. And so, what happened in our organization, at least, is that our newsroom, our whole organization didn't fully catch up with the communities of LA as it is now. This is a majority people of color state. Our school system's majority students of color. Our county is half Latino alone. And we're in that process of kind of, catching up and making sure that, there is some rough representation, parity-wise, in terms of the voices that we choose to amplify and elevate.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the audience, our paper's audience, or news organization's audience doesn't match, I think, what the newer aspirations of our newsroom really is. And so it is this kind of this effort, both with the opinion side and the news side, to kind of figure out ways to, reflect the diversity of LA and all of its facets. And I think that, it's coming at a very fraught time, obviously, for the nation at large. And so it is a tough kind of balance to strike. I think Sewell's doing a great job at it so far.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. We, of course, at the New York Times had a very high profile exit recently, and all of these conversations about how newsrooms are not a good place for the conservative perspective, when, of course, if you are Black or Latino, you also don't really buy into this or Asian or Native American, right? You don't buy into this notion that these newsrooms are these liberal bastions. Like many of us actually don't think our newsrooms are that progressive or that our coverage is that progressive. And certainly, the push, for instance, all the conversation about the need to have conservative columnists at the New York Times, but we don't have a Latino columnist. We don't have an Indigenous columnist. I don't think we have an Asian columnist. So, which is far more reflective of New York City and in many ways the changing country. And the same thing is at LA Times. I mean, the same thing is at Chicago. You can go to Philadelphia Inquirer, you can go to the Detroit Free Press. So we're asking for a certain representation, which I think is of course important and valuable. But it's a diversity of white people still, right? It's like you're asking for more diverse mindsets of white people while not actually reflecting the communities that you are actually supposed to be covering. And I just haven't felt like that's been enough of the conversation, even though it's the perpetual conversation, diversity in newsrooms. I just don't know many Black people and the New York Times who think that we are just this amazingly progressive place in our coverage.
So I want to follow up on that, Nikole, and I apologize because I'm now going to quote you to you. Last week in the conversation you had with Jeff Jarvis, you talked about your time at the Oregonian and about how you almost left journalism. And I mean, obviously, huge lost opportunity for journalism and for everybody who has benefited from your journalism had that happened. And you said, I think, something similar in that conversation, which was, you know, newsrooms want people who look brown or look black and think white and act white. And so I'm curious for you guys, and maybe start Nikole and Erika and then continue, you know, you, not all of you, three of the four of you, have been in positions where, you know, your perspectives have probably been marginalized, misunderstood, mischaracterized, where if you raised your voice, it was perceived perhaps as difficult, and other language that would only get associated with you based on your gender, skin color, or more often. And so I'm curious for each of you how you sort of learned to modulate your voice, both in your newsroom experiences and then, of course, in your writing. And I will just also ask participants, go ahead and put any questions you guys have in the queue so we can get to them after this one before we wrap.
So thank you for that. And it wasn't a direct quote, but I would say what I argued is that newsrooms want phenotype diversity, but not truly the ideological diversity that phenotype diversity could bring. And that certainly was my experience. I mean, Portland is considered a bastion of liberalism, but it's easy to be liberal in a place with that's the whitest major city in the country. You're liberal around everything but race. And that certainly was my experience in that newsroom, where they liked the idea of hiring someone like me, but didn't actually like the journalism that someone like me would bring to the institution. And I ultimately had to leave that. How did I modulate? I don't think that I have. This is where the conflict came, was I got into journalism to do a certain type of journalism. And if I couldn't do that journalism, I didn't want to be a journalist. So this is why I nearly had to leave the profession. And when Steve Engelberg recruited me to come to ProPublica, we had a very frank conversation. And that conversation was the same conversation I had when Dean Baquet recruited me to come to the New York Times, which is, if I can't do the journalism I want to do, I don't want to come. It's just not, it has never been so important to me to work at a particular type of institution with a particular name if I couldn't actually produce the journalism that got me, that I got in the business. So I had to learn, of course, how to navigate. And what I tell young journalists of color and other marginalized journalists all the time is you can control one thing, and that's your own excellence. And there's nothing else you can control outside of that. So I think I've been able to have success because of the standards and rigor I have for my own journalism, and using my unique perspective to produce journalism that other people in that newsroom were not producing. But it's a risk. And I can't tell you, all of us know tons of very talented journalists of color who are no longer in this industry anymore for those very reasons. And it wasn't for lack of talent or ambition or ability, but that this industry will push you out if you don't conform to what it is that they want. And when I advise younger journalists, I tell them you have to decide what is worth it. Because if you don't modulate yourself, you may not be here, or you may not rise, or you may not ever get the prominent type of work that you want to do. But to me, it was just, if I had to give up myself to do that and to be successful, I didn't want success that badly.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever really modulated my voice, so to speak, but I will say I started opinion writing in Indianapolis, which is, as most of you, everybody knows, is a pretty conservative city and a pretty conservative state, though less conservative in the city now. But at the time when I started writing, it was to an audience that I knew wasn't going to agree with probably 90% of what I wrote. And so it was a matter of, how do I frame stories? How do I pitch stories to my editor, columns to my editor? And so I think in the course of that, I learned kind of what you were talking about earlier, Nikole, about like taking a truth and putting a different lens on it. And I think that was something, by writing opinion for 3 to 4 years in that state, in that city, I had to figure out a way to write to that audience and to write about the things that I cared about, which were people of color, Black people, social and economic justice. And I consistently wrote about those things, and I refused for anybody to tell me no, I couldn't write about them, because that was the thing that was important to me. And it was the thing that was important to the people of a city and a state that had not been highlighted in forever. And so I think that in moving to California, those issues are obviously still very important to me. But it's Indiana, California, you fight the same fights in newsrooms. To your point earlier, it's not like these newsrooms are these bastions of progressivism. So I've fought as many battles here in newsrooms, and both in Sacramento and LA, as I fought in Indiana. I just think it's a little bit different. I think here, I think people all assume that they are progressive and they know and they're right. And of course I'm open-minded, and of course this is right. But in the reality is like you have to find a way to kind of like tell them, no, actually, you're not right, and these are the reasons why, and we're going to write about it, and you'll understand. And I think that I think what I tell young journalists too is, to an extent, you have to learn how to pick your battles if you want to write about these things, unless you want to get out of the industry, which is a choice as well. But I also think it's about just being consistent and persistent and understanding, to an extent, there's going to be some headaches, but you can build your audience. And I think we're in a golden age of data journalism where we can show what we write is having resonance. And we can also, you can build an audience, and you can show that there's a reason that why you exist and people care about what you write. And I think, frankly, the 1619 Project is one of the biggest examples of that, that I've seen as a journalist. So.
I've been a writer, I've been a writer about half my career and an editor for the other half. And much of my writing side was pretty much straight news. And I've been reflecting on that period, but more relevantly, I've been thinking about, my role as a gatekeeper now and as a manager, and about, again, the voices I want to amplify and have heard. Many of my most satisfying experiences editing opinion pieces have been with first-time writers. I think that there, is a whole, frankly, this is a nation that I think if everyone listened, that would help. But if everyone wrote, that might also help too. Even some of the people with uglier points of view, not because they deserve more of a platform, but rather because in the act of expressing and then being heard comes a certain empathy that I actually think is a pretty vital civic practice. Suzanne Nossel, the head of Pet America, gets into this in her new book. Excuse me. One of the things I find frustrating, and I want to come back to something that we came across earlier, is, Nikole, I've been watching the kind of statements made by historians and those made by journalists with some interest. There's no doubt that some people have PhDs are in universities, others are talk to real human beings and are situated at news organizations. To me, it's like irrelevant what your institutional setting is. The question is, what questions are you asking and trying to answer? And what evidence are you adducing to advance that argument? In my view, journalists should start to become closer to academia in some sense. And I say that particularly in areas like science and medicine. I've heard from people who are really smart in these areas, who have important things to say. They've never written 1,000 words for a general audience in their entire lifetimes. But they know a lot about how diseases get spread, how they affect communities of color, you name it. They just haven't been given a platform. And I think part of my role as an opinion editor and gatekeeper now is to widen the lens of who gets to comment. I want to go past the usual suspects. I want to also talk to people whose lived expertise whose lived experiences is part of their expertise. Someone said to me recently, instead of going to a labor economist to talk about the plight of, low-wage service workers, why are we not actually commissioning work from someone who is a low-wage service worker? And we did exactly that. And I was really, really proud of that outcome. I do think, Julie, you started with the question of identity. I have felt for a long time that I'm a part of a pretty small community. I'm gay, Asian American, from an immigrant family. And all that has at times made me a rarity in newsrooms. It has been frustrating at times on all three fronts. But I would say the front that I would actually emphasize the most is that, and the identity with which in some ways I kind of feel the strongest, is that I was the first in my family to go to college. And the first to pursue higher education, the first to get a graduate degree. And, this is the part where I hope, if I have any empathy, it comes from this, that, seeing that American society is not, seeing past the myth of meritocracy, and seeing that who gets to even become a journalist is often very, very much predetermined. And so, I'm at a stage of my career where I'm trying to think about opening, by helping to save the journalism business models, how can we thereby also help create new pathways of opportunity, so that the Nikoles and the Erikas of the future are being emerged are being surfaced, cultivated, and empowered starting right now.
That's a great comment, Sewell. I mean, I don't want to, we only have about 10 minutes, so I will just speak very briefly so that we can get to questions. But I would just say to the questions Julie asked about, you know, whether people have had to modulate their views. I mean, as a white editor who right now has the opportunity to run the New York Times Magazine, what I think about a lot is how to create an environment in which that's not something that people have to experience. And that's not to say that we always succeed in doing that. But I mean, one of the things, there's a lot to say there, obviously, and I don't want to take up too much time right now, but one of the things that I think about a lot is that we, in this business, we become attached to certain formats and certain ways of doing things. And part of that is that we're trying to produce product every day, you know, and so there's a certain kind of like you fall into patterns. And I think trying to like maintain or heighten and then maintain a level of awareness about what those patterns, how those patterns leave things out. You know, sometimes those patterns are very useful and even like fantastic, right? Those patterns of how we put together a story can be really successful. But everything that we do is leaving certain things out and like trying to maintain a high level of awareness about that among the editors on the staff so that we aren't like, you know, obviously you have to make a decision in a given piece or a given week, but that you're not making that same decision week after week after week so that you're creating the kind of like environment where multiple voices, and to go back to what we were talking about earlier, points of view are brought to the table so that you're getting like a full picture of, you know, the country, of the world, of all the stuff that we cover.
Thank you. We have so many more questions than we're going to be able to get to. And I feel like it's an impossible choice to choose, but I'm going to go ahead and pick. We have a question here that I think sort of follows what you're talking about in terms of Jake making a safe space so people don't necessarily have to modulate in the same way. And so, you know, kind of creating a new lens and a wider angle so that more views are centered. So the question is, considering the reckonings happening within journalism right now, as people with positions of power in these legacy institutions, which several of you, you know, certainly have by virtue of your positional authority or just, you know, your profile, what reflections have you had about your own culpability in these issues?
Who's reading this question?
Yeah, I would like to ask a clarifying question. Culpability in or for what? I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
We'll see if they respond. Meanwhile, I'll attempt an interpretation. So at some point, many of us have had to make decisions about, you know, do we uppercase B or not, previous to decisions by news organizations to do it, or to hire somebody who might have been wonderful and not gone to the same school as somebody else, or you know, so I think anybody who's sort of been in a position of decision-making authority is doing some reckoning, hopefully is doing some reckoning now and looking back and thinking about decisions they've made that they maybe would consider differently now, and trying to look forward and ahead to what they could do differently. So I think that's the intent of the question. Maybe they'll tell us.
I'm happy to help start an answer, and then maybe Jake might want to chime in. You know, I think when you're leading a page or a section or a part of an institution, you know, you have to kind of, as a leader, inherit, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly that's part of the legacy. I mean, here at the Los Angeles Times, we've had extensive discussions about race and representation, especially following the death of George Floyd. But truth be told, I think they're questions that really date back to, you know, we've had a lot of institutional transformation. Basically, we were bought by a new owner in California and taken out of the control of a Chicago-based chain. Our staff unionized. So we have a new owner, new editors, new leadership, a new labor union, and a new headquarters. So as part of all that newness, I think comes naturally also a question about what happened in the past. So one of the things I'm working on is kind of an unsigned editorial that will really be an institutional reckoning with the Los Angeles Times and race. It's a duty we're taking very heavily. It's not the only thing we're doing. We've asked journalists of color in our newsroom to talk about the relative periods of progress and the relative periods of slide back in recent years. I think this is a moment right now where any leader, any manager needs to be able to self-reflect and acknowledge where, the mistakes that we've made. And also I think people are looking for like a path to move forward. I think the worst possible thing is head in the sand. It didn't happen, or it didn't happen under my watch, or that's not going to help. We may have in the next few months a new president. He is going to inherit a whole heap of mess. It will not help at all if he pretends like that mess isn't the entire shape and context. I think what we're looking for from him would be to acknowledge that we're in a mess and then to outline a plan to get out of it. But part of the power of what Nikole does in particular is help us to see more clearly who we are. To me, that's the most profoundly American thing that you can do. This country has a lot of potential for greatness. I certainly feel like I've done a lot of rethinking of my own identity as an American in light of 1619 Project, right? A lot of immigrants come here and they're like, well, we only arrived in 1975. We what role did we play in this? But I've had a lot of discussions with friends from immigrant families who are like, that's not really the point. The point is that you're American now. And like this whole story, whether it's genocide or enslavement, that whole story is part of our community now. And if we don't understand it, we're not doing what we can do to help this national community move forward. And so, I'm all for reckoning. Hopefully it is not a reckoning and a self-reflection that then leads to paralysis and inaction. Hopefully it's a reckoning that leads one to see more clearly what has happened so that you can be more effective and now bringing about change in our moment.
I would just quickly again, and so we can get to a second question, say that absolutely this is something that I've personally reflected on a lot and that I've tried to encourage other top editors at the magazine to. The magazine is pretty separate from the newsroom, so I'm really just speaking for the magazine now. Top editors at the magazine to reflect on as well as, how have we as a group of editors created a situation, that some aspects of which really do need to change. And I think one of the things, there's many things to talk about there, but maybe I'll just say one thing, is just understanding the way in which kind of like ambient values are not enough. Like there need to be systems of accountability and system and lenses through which you encourage your staff to pay attention to what you're publishing on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, having that like level of awareness of what what's in the magazine. Often when you're cranking out an opinion page or cranking out a magazine, it's so much work that you don't turn around and stop and look at what you've done over the past month or let alone over the past year. And so creating like real clear systems that make all the editors on our staff understand, what it is that all of our work amounts to in terms of who we're representing and what views are getting represented and what types of writers are making it into our pages and where, the gaps are in terms of how we present, the country. That's been something that I have reflected on a lot and feel like we can do better and are already trying to do better. But I think that's a place in which you can run the risk of thinking that sort of ambient values will on their own lead to change, when in fact you really require systems when you're dealing with, like as Sewell said, inheriting a system that inheriting like a situation that in which you have the kind of good, bad, and ugly that comes with the past.
Thank you, guys. We do have more questions, but I know we also promised we would wrap at 12:15, and I don't want to keep you if you have somewhere you have to be at 12:15. Although we definitely could continue.
You have to take at least one more question, so it's not just a single question.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you. So we have a question from Matt Parker, who asked, do you believe there's room for journalists who work in traditional news to create a space for opinion in our personal lives via blog or podcasts? And I think, you can extend that question if you want to include the issue of participating in protests and other ways of expressing opinion if you are not a writer in the opinion space, if you are a journalist who is reporting in other ways. Should I pick somebody to go first?
I can offer a really brief reflection. I think at the New York Times, one thing that has been positive is that there's more news analysis in the Sunday Review section. So reporters are being asked to take a more kind of personal or voicey perspective that doesn't slide into direct opinion, but allows them a little bit more creative latitude and freedom. And I think all news organizations are trying to find a lot of news organizations are trying to find ways to do that right now. We're debating whether we should have news reporters do stints in editorial writing. Again, I think the labeling of things are important, because for readers, you need transparency about what is what. But I think for our staff and for our staff's career development, yeah, we do need people to have more outlets for them to find their voice, so that we don't lose people from journalism. I think that's hugely important. I'm going to punt on the larger question of how much political activism should be permitted. That's a really active subject of debate right now, and one that we could easily spend an hour on.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that it's important for younger reporters to have some sort of outlet so they can, beyond Twitter, to be able to express their views. I think that, it's going to be integral, I think, to keeping people within our industry as opposed for them to quit. I mean, because the reality is, I think in our newsrooms, while we're changing the culture, it's not going to happen overnight. And there's a lot of people who have needs right now who feel like they're not being heard, like they're being shut down. And so I think anything that we can do to make sure that they feel like they are a integral part of our newsroom, and people who don't necessarily have the voice to demand the attention of the executive editor, but they have some sort of outlet where they can actually say that. And I think that the Times has actually done a really good job with that in the last 6 months, of making sure when issues arise that people have that platform to do something, even if it's just quickly off the news. As for the political activism part, I have my opinions on it. I tend to take a more liberal view on that. I know probably a lot of management does not, but I think for me, and I wrote about this earlier back in June, when here in LA County, there was no Pride Parade here, but they did try to combine it with Black Lives Matter for a time. And so there was this huge debate about whether or not reporters should be able to go to Pride now that it's affiliated with Black Lives Matter, which I personally found offensive because I am gay and Black. And I was like, why is it that suddenly my identity is being politicized now that it involves Black Lives Matter? But if I was just going as a lesbian, nobody would care. And so I think those are the kinds of conversations we need to have in newsrooms, because there's this legacy of just, this is the way we've always done things, this is the way we think about things, and that's not the right thing to do. And we should, as part of that self-reflection and reckoning, these are the things I think that news organizations have to really think about.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly add so people can leave, go on about the rest of their day. But, I'm kind of mixed on this. I in some ways, clearly my own writing is reflective of being able to have a voice and in your work. And I know as a young reporter, really for most of my career, I really struggled with not being able, I mean, you become a journalist because you want things to change, right? It is a form of activism in and of itself. And yet you're told that you have to cut off, all of those other views. At the same time, do I really want to know the politics of the political reporters who are covering the White House? I don't. And I think we have to, I think it's a matter of what are we actually giving up? When I first talked about the story about choosing a school for my daughter, and I pitched it, and then I wanted to retract the pitch because I thought a lot about what does it mean to so explicitly say what you feel about a beat that you're covering. And who won't talk to me now because they know explicitly how I feel. And I would be lying if I said that there are certain sources that I've wanted to include in a story who are no longer interested in being in a story I write about school segregation because they already know my perspective on it. So I just think it's always a matter of balancing and figuring out, if I'm not writing about politics, maybe it's okay. If I am, then I do have to be much more careful about what I express. I do, however, I don't feel like would go to a police protest, but is it not okay for me to go to a protest saying that, you know, Black people shouldn't be killed? Well, I don't really feel like that's a political stance. I just feel like that's, you know, being a human being. So those things are very difficult, and it is clearly much more difficult if you are coming from one of those marginalized groups. It's easy to have this sense of objectivity, and we don't engage in this type of like political interacting when you're, you know, the laws of your country and the institutions of your country are built in service of you. But Black journalists have just never had that freedom because we almost always existed in opposition to the laws and values and structures of our country. So I'm happy that we're having these conversations, but I think it's very complicated.
The last thing I would say on that, I'm kind of where Nikole is in a way, in that I just feel like I'm ambivalent and not sure exactly what the right decision is when it comes to specifically the question of like social media and reporters on social media. I mean, I think Eric makes a really good point, which is that a younger generation of reporters for whom expressing yourself online is just totally second nature, perhaps more so than those of us who are not going to say anybody other than myself are above the age of 40. Like, and finding space for journalists who do just live and breathe online, and making them feel welcome in newsrooms has to be a priority, or else there's no future to journalism. But at the same time, I am deeply conflicted about like the way that, you know, in a what really is a kind of war with a kind of war over this contested ground of like fact itself, the way that you know, bad faith actors sort of weaponize like any stray tweet from a journalist, or maybe not even a journalist, a person who works on like a, you know, different department of the New York Times, to be something that came from the New York Times, and then spin it into just a whole lot of noise, which it's not that simply telling people that they can't you know, post online is a solution to that, because it's a much bigger problem than that. But I'm ambivalent and conflicted about the environment of you know, contested fact that we are living in, and how social media use sort of can contribute to that like sense of confusion and chaos and argument that surrounds a lot of work, and sometimes I do think prevents people from seeing like the stories themselves.
Well, sometimes those things about which we're ambiguous generate some of the most interesting reflections that are unexpected. So hopefully we will have more conversations about some of those things. And meanwhile, I just want to thank you guys again for your insight and your time. I do feel like I could listen to you for hours, and I feel like you guys would have interesting conversations. And out of respect for your time and everyone's time, thank you for staying longer, and for spending time with us today. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. They were all very, very good. The Journalism Institute, if this is your first experience with us, or your fourth or fifth, we're here to help during this challenging time. We've waived all registration fees for programming since March in light of the pandemic. We're hoping you'll give us and our work a thumbs up with the donation to support learning like this, and that you'll complete a survey about your experience today, so that we can continue to design programs that you and other journalists need now and later. So you'll receive links to do both of those things by email shortly, along with a link to this program in video form, which we hope you'll return to as a valuable resource. So thank you again, stay well, and we will hope to see you again back here soon.